I always believed that families broke you in small, predictable ways: arguments, comparisons, careless words. But I was wrong. Mine didn't break me quietly. They shattered me in a single moment, in front of a room full of people, with smiles stretched so wide they almost looked innocent. Almost. I remember standing there, frozen, as my mother praised my sister's perfect marriage like it was some divine achievement. Every word she spoke felt like a blade sliding under my skin. She talked about loyalty, devotion, sacrifice. All the things she said my sister embodied, things she believed I never could. She didn't know the truth I carried. She didn't know what I had discovered. She didn't know that behind that shining marriage was a darkness that could swallow an entire family whole. But I stayed quiet. I watched. I let them celebrate a lie. Because I had already made my decision. I wasn't going to expose the secret in anger. Not in a breakdown. Not in desperation. I was going to do it with precision, slowly, silently, and at the exact moment it would cut the deepest. And when that moment finally came, my reply didn't just stop the celebration. It changed everything. Do you want to know what I said and why it stunned everyone in that room? Before everything collapsed, my life looked calm from the outside, steady, predictable, even admirable in the ways people measure success, without ever asking if you're actually happy. I worked a stable job at a small architectural firm, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where birthdays were celebrated with store-bought cake and mismatched candles. My days began early, usually before the sun rose, when the city still felt half asleep and the streets carried that heavy quiet that makes you believe anything is possible. I liked those mornings. They made me feel like I had a head start on the world. I lived alone, not because I needed distance, but because solitude felt like a soft blanket after years of growing up in a house where noise filled every corner. My mother adored chaos. She thrived on movement, on attention, on turning every small event into a performance. My sister, naturally, grew up in the spotlight, polished, praised, and placed on a pedestal so high I often wondered if she even saw the rest of us. I was the quieter one, the observer, the one who blended into the background so effortlessly that sometimes I even forgot I was there. Still, I had built a life I was proud of. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I spent my evenings tending to small routines, watering my plants, eating simple dinners, catching up on shows I never finished. Those habits grounded me. They kept me steady. And in the rare moments when my mother's criticisms echoed too loudly in my memory, those little rituals reminded me that I created a world where my voice mattered, even if only to myself. My sister, Clara, lived a very different life. She had always moved quickly, through relationships, through jobs, through phases of identity that she clung to briefly before discarding them like outgrown clothes. Then she met him, the man she would eventually marry. Overnight, she transformed into the ideal daughter my mother always wanted: graceful, devoted, impossibly perfect. At least that was the version she presented. The version everyone applauded. Whenever I visited home, it felt as though every conversation eventually circled back to Clara's marriage. How supportive he was. How amazing they were together. How she was glowing. My mother repeated those lines with rehearsed enthusiasm, often followed by a sigh that landed squarely on me, as though my existence was a reminder of everything she believed I lacked. I tried not to let it bother me. I told myself families weren't perfect, that favoritism was just an unfortunate flaw, not a personal attack. But over time, something began to feel off. Little comments. Strange shifts in the way people in the family spoke to me. Moments where my mother's praise for Clara felt a little too defensive, as though she was trying to convince herself of something. There were times I felt like I was walking into a conversation that had ended just moments before I arrived. Times when my sister looked at me with a softness that didn't match the confidence she displayed for everyone else. Times when he, my brother-in-law, avoided my eyes in a way that felt strangely deliberate, like he feared I could see something he was trying to hide. I brushed it off. I didn't want to assume the worst. I didn't want to dig where I didn't belong. And honestly, I didn't think I mattered enough in their world to be tied to any secret worth hiding. Looking back, I can see how naive that was. Because the truth was already woven into the edges of my life. It existed in the tiny pauses between words, in the subtle tension that crept whenever I entered a room, in the sudden silence my presence sometimes brought. I didn't recognize it then, but the ground beneath me had already begun to crack. And everything, the quiet mornings, the predictable routines, the fragile peace I had built, was about to shift. I just didn't know what would trigger it. I didn't know how deeply it would cut. And I had no idea that the storm waiting on the horizon wasn't just going to shatter my world. It was going to reshape it into something I never planned for. Something that would eventually lead me to that room, that celebration, and the words that stunned everyone. But the first fracture began long before that day. I just wasn't ready to see it. The first real crack in the picture-perfect illusion appeared on a quiet Sunday morning. I remember it clearly, because nothing about the day seemed unusual. I woke early, made coffee, and sat near my window where the sunlight landed softly on the floor. I wasn't thinking about my family or the strange tension I had felt growing around me. My mind was on my work, my errands, and the plant I kept forgetting to report. But life rarely announces the moment it's about to change. Often it hides in the most ordinary minutes. I had been searching for a missing document for days, something I needed for a project at work. I decided to check a box of old belongings I had stored years ago, random things from my childhood home that I never sorted through. The box was dusty, heavy, and filled with bits of a past I didn't care to revisit. But as I rummaged through the clutter, my hand brushed against something unexpected, my sister's old tablet. It must have ended up in my things by accident years ago. I almost set it aside. Almost. But curiosity has a way of nudging you, especially when something in your life already feels off. I turned it on, expecting a dead battery or a forgotten password that would stop me. Instead, it opened immediately. No lock screen, no protection. It was as if the universe had decided that I was meant to see what hid inside. At first, all I saw were half-finished notes, old pictures, and college assignments. Nostalgic, but harmless. Then I noticed a folder tucked oddly between two academic documents, one with a vague name. It wasn't encrypted. It wasn't even hidden well. It was just there, quietly waiting. Inside the folder were screenshots. Photo after photo. Long paragraphs. Messages. But not between friends or classmates. They were between my sister and my boyfriend. My breath caught in my chest, and for a moment, I couldn't move. Each message felt like a stone dropping into the pit of my stomach, sinking deeper and deeper as I scrolled. It wasn't just flirtation or innuendo. It was a plan. Meetings. Confessions. Little acknowledgments of moments that now twisted my memories into something unrecognizable. The betrayal wasn't new. It had started years earlier, long before my sister's marriage, long before I even realized my relationship was slipping away. They had built their connection in the shadows while I was busy trying to build a life. Every message rewrote my past into a lie I never asked to live. But the worst part wasn't the words. It was the dates. This wasn't an old mistake long buried. It wasn't a moment of weakness that faded over time. They were still talking, still meeting, still connected. Even after she married. Even after I moved on. Even after we all pretended our lives had taken separate paths. I remember sitting there with the tablet in my lap, my heart pounding so hard it felt like my ribs might crack under the pressure. My hands trembled, but not from shock. From something deeper. Something darker. Something that didn't ask permission to rise inside me. Anger. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was cold, heavy, and frighteningly calm. The kind of anger that doesn't need to scream because it already knows exactly how much damage it can do. I didn't cry. Not then. There was no room for tears. Not when the truth was burning through every remaining illusion I had about my family and my past. I closed the tablet carefully, as though the device itself might shatter from the weight of what it held. I set it on the couch beside me and stared at the wall for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. Everything I believed about loyalty, trust, and family was suddenly dissolving. I felt like the air had been punched out of my lungs, Yet my mind was clearer than it had ever been. But clarity didn't bring comfort. It brought questions. How much did my mother know? How long had this been happening? Why had no one told me? And how could my sister, my own blood, smile in my face while living a double life that cut directly through mine? I thought that was the breaking point. It wasn't. A few days later, I discovered something far worse. My brother-in-law, the man my mother adored and praised endlessly, was involved in the secret too. Not romantically, but knowingly. He had known for months. Years, maybe. There were emails, messages, and photos connecting him to the truth. He was aware of the entire affair long before he proposed to my sister. And he had chosen silence, not out of love, but leverage. He had married her knowing her deepest betrayal. He had entered their union holding a weapon only he controlled. Their marriage wasn't built on love, it was built on blackmail. Suddenly, everything my mother bragged about, their loyalty, their devotion, their picture-perfect life, felt sickeningly staged. A performance wrapped in secrets and power plays. My mother's praise wasn't pride. It was delusion, fueled by the belief that Clara had achieved a life worthy of envy. But envy was the last thing I felt. What I felt was something closer to justice whispering in my ear, telling me that the truth needed to come out, but not in anger, not recklessly. No. It needed to come out in a way that exposed every lie they had built, every mask they had worn, every performance they had perfected. It needed to be undeniable, unforgettable, and irreversible. So I watched. I waited. I collected everything quietly, like an archivist gathering pieces of a ruined civilization. Screenshots, copies, backups, timelines. I didn't know what I was planning yet, but I knew I needed evidence. Not for them. For me. To make sure I wasn't imagining the cruelty that had shaped my life behind my back. As weeks passed, the tension in my family grew. I felt it in the way my mother questioned me more. In this way my sister avoided me unless others were around. In the way my brother-in-law maintained an overly polished friendliness that made my skin crawl. They sensed something shifting, but they didn't know what. And they certainly didn't know that I had the truth, every piece of it, sitting quietly in a folder on my computer. Then the moment arrived. A family celebration. A gathering meant to honor my sister's marriage, her achievements, her so-called perfect life. I was invited not as a member of the family, but as a witness to their carefully crafted facade. My mother was radiant with pride. My sister wore the kind of happiness that comes from pretending. My brother-in-law stood close to her, smiling like a man who had everything under control. But I knew better, because beneath the table, in my bag, rested the proof that could turn their world inside out. The celebration built slowly, layer by layer. Speeches. Laughter. Toasts. Compliments. Moments where everything felt almost normal, almost believable. But I felt the tension tightening around me like a rope, pulling me closer to a moment I couldn't avoid. Then my mother stood up and began her praise. Her glowing, rehearsed monologue about my sister's marriage, her devotion, her loyalty, her perfect life. Each word was a lie. Each sentence was a reminder of what they had done to me. And as I listened, something inside me snapped, not in rage, but in determination. I knew exactly what I had to do. Not to hurt them, not to break them, but to make them face the truth they had buried so deeply they thought it would never see the light again. The room quieted. Eyes turned toward me, and I felt the entire story, the betrayal, the secrets, the careful deceit, gather behind my lips like a storm ready to break. This was the moment everything had been building toward. But I didn't reveal everything. Not yet. Because the most devastating part of my plan, the part that would leave them with nowhere to hide, was still coming. And when it finally arrived, it would do far more than expose their lies. It would dismantle the life they had constructed from the ruins of mine. The moment my mother finished speaking, the room felt unbearably still. Her words hung in the air like a curtain that refused to fall, separating the glowing fantasy she adored from the truth I carried like a thunderstorm tightening in my chest. Everyone watched her with admiration. Everyone believed the version of life she painted, A life shaped by devotion, loyalty, and the kind of perfection that photographs beautifully but crumbles under the slightest pressure. I watched her too, but unlike the others, I wasn't blinded by pride or performance. I saw the cracks. I saw the shadows behind the smiles. I saw the weight of the lies my sister and her husband thought they had buried beneath layers of charm and reputation. And I felt my heartbeat shift, slow, steady, deliberate. It was time. I rose from my seat, and for a moment, the room didn't notice. Conversations continued. Glasses clinked. Laughter rippled softly through the air. But as I stepped forward, chairs turned. Heads lifted. My mother's smile froze, caught between pride and curiosity. My sister's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, as though her instincts recognized danger before her mind did. And her husband, always composed, tightened his jaw just enough for me to see the fear he thought he could hide. I felt every gaze fall on me. For once, I didn't shrink into the background. I became the center of the room. I stood there with the weight of all their secrets pressing against my ribs, begging to be released. Years of betrayal. Years of lies. Years of watching them shape a life built on foundations I now knew were rotten. And in that moment, my moment, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. Revenge wasn't rage. Revenge wasn't chaos. Revenge was clarity. I reached into my bag and felt the smooth edge of the folder I'd prepared. Every screenshot, every message, every undeniable piece of truth that exposed the twisted web they had spun. My hands didn't tremble. My voice didn't waver. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't scared. I was ready. As I placed the folder on the table, the sound echoed through the room like a breaking wave. Quiet, but powerful enough to shift the atmosphere instantly. People leaned in, curious, confused. My mother stepped closer, her expression flickering from excitement to concern as she sensed something she couldn't yet name. I didn't need words to explain what the folder was. All I needed to do was open it. The pages inside weren't dramatic on their own, just printed conversations, timestamps, photos, emails. But together, they formed a story that shattered the illusion of harmony my family had paraded for years. One by one, I revealed the pieces. The affair, the deception, the manipulation, blackmail, every truth they had hidden beneath polished smiles. I watched my sister's face drain of color. I watched her husband's mask crack so violently he couldn't hold it together anymore. And I watched my mother, who had built her entire identity around my sister's perfect marriage, sway slightly as though the ground had been pulled from beneath her feet. The shock in the room was palpable. Breaths held. Hands covering mouths. People exchanging glances they couldn't interpret. A silence so heavy it pressed against my skin like heat. My sister reached for a page, her hands trembling, but I pulled it slightly away, not out of cruelty, but because this wasn't her moment to control anymore. It was mine. For years, they controlled the narrative. They shaped the story. They cast me as the quiet one, the lesser one, the one who should remain grateful for the scraps of affection and validation they offered. But now the truth was laid out in the center of the room for everyone to see, and the power they once held slipped through their fingers like sand. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I simply stood there and allowed them to confront the reality they created. It was the purest form of vengeance, forcing them to face the truth in front of the very people they tried so desperately to impress. There was no way to twist it, no way to deny it, no way to shift the blame. Not when every page bore their own words, their own choices, their own betrayals. And as they unraveled, something unexpected happened inside me. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt free. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying their burdens. I wasn't silencing my instincts. I wasn't shrinking to maintain their comfort. I was standing in my truth. The truth they thought I would never find. The truth they thought I didn't deserve to know. My sister sank into her chair, her breath shallow, her eyes filling with a desperation I had never seen before. Her husband stared at the floor, unable to lift his head. And my mother, my dramatic, attention-loving mother, looked lost, as if someone had snatched the script of her life from her hands and torn it apart in front of her. I didn't apologize. I didn't soften the blow. I let the silence reveal everything they tried to hide. Because revenge doesn't always require destruction. Sometimes, it only requires truth.
Cold. Clear.
Undeniable. As I gathered the remaining documents, the room remained suspended in stunned quiet. No one dared move. No one dared speak. They were all waiting for me to say something, to explain myself, to tell them what this moment meant. But they didn't deserve explanations. Not when the truth spoke louder than anything I could have said. I took one final look at the three people who had shaped so much of my life without ever considering the damage they caused. My mother's trembling hands. My sister's collapsed posture. My brother-in-law's defeated stare. And I felt no guilt. Only clarity. Without another word, I turned toward the exit. My footsteps felt steady, grounded, and powerful. Every step away from them felt like reclaiming a part of myself I had long forgotten. But just as I reached the door, I paused. Not because I doubted myself, but because I knew the next part of my story, the part that truly mattered, wasn't about what I had exposed. It was about what I chose to do next. Revenge had brought me to this moment, but how I walked forward would determine the rest of my life. And as I stepped into the cool air outside, I realized something profound. The climax of my revenge wasn't the destruction I left behind. It was the freedom that waited ahead. What came after that moment changed everything. When I stepped out of that room, the silence I left behind felt heavier than any words I could have spoken. I didn't need to stay to see the rest unfold. The truth had already taken root in every corner of that celebration. In the hours and days that followed, everything shifted. Their world, built so delicately on lies, manipulation, and unspoken agreements, began to crumble piece by piece, and I watched it happen not with satisfaction, but with a strange, steady calm that surprised even me. My mother's pride collapsed first. The image she had curated for years, the pedestal she built for my sister, the praise she handed out so freely, it all cracked under the weight of reality. She spent days trying to make sense of it, trying to reconcile the perfect daughter she worshipped with the woman who had betrayed her own blood. For once, she could no longer ignore the imbalance she had created between us. Her calls to me were hesitant, quieter, stripped of the certainty she used to speak with. She apologized, not dramatically or loudly, but in small, trembling ways that showed she finally understood how deeply she had failed me. Whether forgiveness will ever come is still something I'm learning to navigate. Some wounds don't close as easily as others. My sister's life fell apart next. The affair she thought she'd buried resurfaced in front of everyone she had tried to impress. The trust she worked so hard to pretend she had with her husband dissolved instantly. Her marriage, the one my mother celebrated so proudly, fractured within days. And for the first time, my sister faced the consequences of the choices she made, without the usual safety net of excuses or special treatment. She tried to reach out to me more times than I expected, but I couldn't offer her comfort. Not because I wanted her to hurt, but because I finally understood that healing doesn't come from pretending the past didn't happen, it comes from owning it. Her husband wasn't spared either. The man who thought he could control everything through silence and secrecy found himself exposed in ways he never anticipated. His reputation slipped. People questioned the version of himself he had curated so carefully. And maybe most importantly, he realized that the leverage he held over my sister, over the truth, no longer belonged to him. He had built a life anchored in control, and once he lost it, he had no idea how to function. That was his downfall, and he brought it on himself. I didn't celebrate any of it. Watching lives unravel isn't satisfying when the people involved are connected to your own pain. Instead, what I felt was something quieter, simpler, almost unfamiliar. Relief. For years, I carried a heaviness I couldn't name, something buried so deep I convinced myself it wasn't there. But once the truth was out, once the masks fell away, I finally understood what I had been holding on to. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't resentment. It was the ache of never being seen for who I was, overshadowed by a version of my sister that was never real to begin with. And now, without those illusions, I could finally exist on my own terms. The aftermath of my revenge wasn't chaotic. It wasn't violent. It wasn't filled with dramatic endings or explosive all-out battles. Instead, it was quiet, almost reflective. Truth has a strange way of settling into people's lives like a storm that passes overnight. You wake up the next morning and realize the world hasn't ended, but it looks different, cleaner, clearer, stripped of everything that once clouded your vision. In the weeks that followed, I noticed something changing inside me. The anger that once consumed me softened. The tension I carried in my shoulders was released. My home felt warmer. My mornings felt lighter. And for the first time in years, I could look in the mirror and see someone I recognized, someone I trusted. Revenge didn't give me back the years I lost. It didn't erase the betrayal or magically heal old wounds. But it did something I didn't expect. It returned my voice, my power, my sense of worth. It allowed me to step out of the shadows I had been pushed into and to stand firmly in the truth of my own experiences. It also taught me something about justice, something I think many people overlook. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about exposure, about bringing hidden things into the light so they can no longer grow in the dark. Sometimes it's about reclaiming your story, your dignity, your peace. And sometimes, justice begins the moment you stop accepting less than you deserve. I know people often warn against revenge, that it changes you, consumes you, turns you into someone else. And maybe that's true for some. But what I learned is that revenge doesn't always twist you into darkness. Sometimes, it's the very thing that frees you from it. It's not the act of revenge itself that defines you, it's the intention behind it and the person you become afterward. I became someone stronger, someone braver, someone who no longer shrank to fit the expectations of others. My story became bigger than the betrayal that started it, bigger than the lies that held it together, bigger than the revenge that broke it apart. And here's the truth I want to leave you with. We all carry moments of hurt, moments when someone we loved, trusted, or believed shattered something inside us. Some of us bury that pain. Some of us try to forgive it. And some of us choose to confront it head-on. Not because we want to destroy someone else, but because we want to rebuild ourselves. My revenge wasn't just about exposing what they did. It was about reclaiming what I lost. And standing in the ruins afterward, I realized something undeniable. The moment I chose myself was the moment their power over me ended. So I ask you this. When the truth finally comes to light, when the people who wronged you are forced to face the consequences of their actions, will you be ready to walk forward, or will you still be holding on to the pain they caused? Your answer might determine more than you think. Because sometimes the real victory isn't in what you destroy. It's in what you finally set free.